everyone, and welcome to the LGFP webinar series, which has kicked off again for the 2021 year. And look, today's webinar is quite an interesting topic, and I'm pleased to promote Crowe Australasia, who are going to run this webinar for us. And Crowe are an LGFP value partner, which is appreciated. And look, today the session we'll be looking at probity reviews for local government entities. Obviously, probity is very important, particularly in the procurement process. And it's more than just about avoiding corrupt and dishonest conduct. It's more about proactively demonstrating that in a procurement process, it's robust and the outcomes are beyond reproach, and that you're generally getting good outcomes for the community, your residents, and your organisation. So the topics we're covering today will include tendering guidelines, evaluation panels, probity plans, probity reviews, and also just areas of improvement that Alison and Brad will run through. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Alison Lee and Brad Bowen from Crowe Australasia, and over to you guys, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. I'll just quickly share the screen. Hopefully that's come up for everybody. And just wanted to say thanks very much for having us this morning, and start with just an introduction of ourselves. So my name's Alison Lee. I'm an associate partner with Crowe. I'm in our Albury office. So I studied and started my career in Canberra, and then I've moved back to Albury and have been with Crowe for the last 11 years. So work across lots of different industries, so local government, water, alpine resort management boards, and health. Pass over to you, Brad.
Thanks, Alison. So Alison, I think, is driving the slide deck today. So at different times, I'll either wink or nod. And so perhaps she'll just put it up into presentation mode. And my name's Brad Bowen. I've been an accountant for over 25 years, with a high focus on government entities and specifically local government in both Victoria and New South Wales, with a high focus on larger regional councils and moving out into the rural council space.
Excellent, thanks, Brad. Just having a bit of trouble getting that into slideshow mode, but hopefully you can still see those slides okay. So I'm just going to move across to the agenda. So we've already covered a couple of areas there that we're going to cover this morning. So we will make the slides available after the session. Please pop any questions up into the Q&A as we go along. We'll answer some of those at the end of the session. If we run out of time, we'll ensure that we come back to you with answers to all questions that are popped up in the Q&A. So in terms of getting started, procurement processes are potential points of failure in risk management and ethical practice policies. So they're a basic requirement of successful operations, which makes probity auditing an important role, but it's sometimes overlooked. So we're going to run through the guidelines today, what evaluation panels look like, the requirements to be included in a probity plan, what a probity review might look like from an audit perspective, some common areas for improvement, as well as some case studies as we go along.
Yeah, thanks, Alison. So that would take us through to slide 4. And so from here, what I wanted to include was a why slide. So why probity reviews, and really it comes from this emerging prove me trend that we're seeing very much come through in broader business, and it's very much being lived in local government. So probity would fit down in the prove me end. So once upon a time where we simply relied on having good people and there was this trust me ethos happening. We've sort of seen it move through these stages of tell me, show me, and then down into the prove me outcome, and probity very much forms a part of that. One of the broader challenges in local government, especially rural and regional councils, is stakeholder management. Expectations regarding access to information have changed, they're evolving, and so it's this social license that needs to be managed, the access to information, and probity is a key part of that. We thought then what we'd do is include a definitions slide just to sort of help set the scene for what probity is. And so slide 5 really is taking us into the definitional element of that. And there's 2 streams to it. There's the actual element. So it means more than just avoiding corrupt or dishonest conduct, but there's also those perception elements that need to be worked through. When we go through control breakdowns and misgivings that get captured by whoever the state-based regulator is, in New South Wales, ICAC, Victoria, IBAC, and up into Queensland entities, that root cause assessment, it's people, and for a long time we've lived and died by our, is somebody a good person? But what we've found in that test is that good people can make bad choices. So in order to strengthen that model, then we've got a systems and processes and a governance element. And it's those 3 streams that really help define a robust structure. And where we're seeing the step change is mostly around the systems and processes and governance elements. And they're the key items that you'll see woven through today's presentation. Alison, you'll go.
Excellent, thank you. So the next couple of slides that we're going to run through are the Probity and Integrity in Procurement Queensland guidelines. So we've got a number of sections of those guidelines included in the next slide. So we're not going to go through each of those points individually, but just wanted to pull out some of the real life examples that we've seen and how they apply back to those guidelines. What we do have at the end as well is some links to these guidelines and then some other examples of documentation that you can come back to as well. So the first part we have here is around Principle 3. So it outlines the government's requirements and expectations about integrity, probity and accountability within procurement. So it makes clear that there's high standards of integrity and probity must always be observed. Accountability of decisions made must be demonstrated and the documentation to back up those decisions as well. And probity must be part of the procurement culture and not a standalone consideration. So things like training and those types of things come into that cultural aspect as well. So just moving on to our next slide. So this is bringing in some of the legislation context. So under the Code of Conduct for Queensland Public Service, there's a number of principles that apply, particularly to probity. So it's integrity and impartiality, promoting the good of the public, commitment to systems of governance, and accountability and transparency. So an example that we're just going to touch on here is around conflicts of interest as well. So that is very important in the probity process. So conflict of interest would be a declaration that you would sign up front at the start of the process. An example that came to mind for us was around ensuring that you document your process for considering how you complete those forms. So we had an example of a successful tenderer had one of the staff members from council had actually worked there. It was a number of years, like 15 years ago, and for a very small amount of time. And one of the unsuccessful tenderers became aware of this and then sort of challenged the process. It was reviewed and it was deemed that it was very minor and didn't actually impact that assessment process, but it's really around making sure that when you're signing those conflict forms that you're really considering from a perception perspective as well as a, oh, it was so long ago, it doesn't sort of matter type scenario as well. So conflicts of interest is something that's important that will come up as we move through. Back to you, Brad.
Yeah, so from here, what we're going to do is, as a scene setter, take you through the next few slides. Alice and I are going to work through the 4 focus areas. From here, we're going to cover through managing probity relative to the value of risk, conflict of interest management, accountability and transparency of decision and process, and then Alison's going to kick us off with fairness and impartiality.
Thanks, Brad. So with fairness and impartiality, there's a number of elements to this. So the first one is around planning, so that all tender documentation is clear and clear to everybody, so that the specifications are free from bias, so that they're not sort of more favourable to a particular party, whether that might be the incumbent or someone else within the marketplace. And making sure that you always use a competitive process, so through that open tender process. So another part there of that first area, after your planning, is around the go-to-market plan. So one area here is around your evaluation criteria and weighting. So this is an area which might seem simple in terms of setting your criteria and weightings, but that's something that's very key to be done prior to going out to tender. So we've seen a number of council policies that have particular criteria that you need to have. So there might be 5 or 6 areas, but then there is some ability to be able to move what the weightings are. So it's important that those weightings, so criteria 1, for example, you might be able to have between 10 and 30% as your weighting, making sure that you've agreed what those weightings are and that they're in line with your procurement policy as well before going out to the market. And those criteria and their weightings should be set in the probity plan. So the next part of fairness, impartiality after going to market is the evaluation. So evaluating and then awarding of the contract. So I guess an important area here is around evaluating what is supplied. So particularly if you have tenderers applying that you may know of some other work that they've done, it's really making sure that you're assessing what is provided in that specific tender documentation for that specific tender.
And so in the accountability and transparency of decision and process, I suppose the key call out here is the plan is to get a plan before you know you need a plan. So start with a plan. In terms of planning and having a procurement plan, councils have different contracts of different sizes, different risk elements, and so we feel that the best approach is a fit-for-purpose one. And so if it's at the light end, what you might have is more of a checklist type approach, but still something that's documented that lets you follow a systemised and agreed process. And at the larger end or riskier end, would involve a full probity plan development. The other key call out from this page is multiple officers. So in the lighter end, where exposure comes into play for councils, is if you go down the path of only including one officer in the process. So at a minimum, have 2 people involved, and that always provides a safer outcome. Far too often, Alison and I encounter outcomes that are being challenged at the end of the event, and at some point choice was made to only deploy one council officer to the evaluation criteria. The next element here is around supplier communication, and really the call outs here would be in that planning phase, have a think about how you want queries to come in. And if we're trying to be equitable and fair to all parties, questions should come in via writing. Now that can be in an email, that's completely fine. But what that enables is a question and an answer type approach, not only to the person who asked the question, but in fairness to all the other tenderers as well. So council really should be pushing down that process as opposed to taking individual questions. Another methodology is opening for an open Q&A session that's invited to all interested participants, but very much we'd see the question and answer type technique documented, which addresses both the party who made the inquiry and informing those who are eligible to be such informed. The other thing to consider is whether you're going to use a nominated council officer and their ordinary email address, which they need to return to their day job and continue on with the business of council's affairs. So the other thing that we're seeing having increasing prevalence here is using a procurement email address. So that is defining the email traffic regarding that procurement to that particular inbox, and it's managed and dealt with at that time, which provides that extra degree of separation away from an individual who may be operating in that secretary type function of the contract management. The last element here across on page 14, these ones I see as housekeeping type elements, and really good housekeeping, so important, because they're compromised when two things happen: when either insufficient resources are assigned to the evaluation panel, or the panel doesn't use a documented plan. So in both of those instances, it's very hard to unscramble the egg and work backwards. So the smart calls and decisions at the start of the process would be making sure that sufficient people have been assigned, and that at a minimum we're using a documented plan.
Thanks, Brad. So the third area is around embedding probity culture. So within that, there's then 4 areas of focus. So the first is around the conflict of interest management. So going back to the example earlier around ensuring that there is those conflict checks completed, and that it is also around whether it's an actual perceived or potential conflict. So one area here which might be useful is in your conflict declarations having some explanatory guidance and examples attached, because that can then potentially prompt some particular areas or trains of thought which may then help in completing that form. And if you do know upfront that there is a conflict, it's easier to address than if it's something that comes to light throughout the process or even at the end of the process. Another area within the culture is around individual officers conducting procurement processes. So Brad's covered that a little in terms of whether it's an individual or a panel. And one important thing here we've got is agenda items. So everyone would complete their declaration at the start, but if you've got a procurement process that might be running over several months or even over a year, it would be good to have that included in your meeting agendas. So just double checking if has anything particularly changed since the last evaluation meeting, and just ticking off that no one has any conflicts of interest as you go along. And this one is just around how you would then manage those conflicts of interest. So it is recommended that there is a centralised register kept, and that you would have a nominated person to ensure that that register is up to date and maintained. And then that is definitely something that you can use throughout your process.
So I suppose from my perspective, if you had just one takeaway from today's session, it would be to grab your council's procurement plan and check, does it articulate when the probity process should commence? Are the decision triggers relevant? And have they been set many years ago and then let lag, and they don't keep pace with what's currently better practice or is being observed or consistent with the expectations of your stakeholders? We were chatting with Michael before the session started today, and this element of a two-stream approach to understanding when probity applies is it's just not value-driven. You also need to have a risk overlay. There are some projects that are particularly passion projects of constituents, and the other one that we would call out is if there's a related party involved. It's possible that council might have even a controlled entity associated with, say, swimming pool management or operating a rates function, something of that nature. And so if it falls into the high risk category, despite it might being lower value, it's possible that it will slide across to the right-hand side of the screen, and we're seeing more of that probity type element featuring in it. The other reflection that I'd have coming from this slide is some things what we see council doing really well is the upfront contract awarding and the initial outcome of the contract. But what happens is then as the contract pulls through and it reaches an extension point, sometimes the awarding of the extension can actually be quite loose and gappy. So another item just to keep in view is making sure that the strength of your procurement process applying to your capital projects, then your normal procurement process is similarly applying in that space where you're exercising a contract extension. And again, that word of warning that if it involves a particularly passionate topic for your ratepayers, we've had some closer to us in terms of outdoor basketball courts, that may trigger the need for a consideration of that probity inclusion, despite it actually being quite a low value item in council's overall budget outcome. So just keep an eye on contract extensions and make sure that the same systems and processes and governance rigor that we're setting up here applies in those spaces as well.
Thanks, Brad. So that is an overview of those 4 areas from that guide. So as mentioned, we'll provide a link to that and you'll be able to have a bit more read in detail. So there is a section B within the guidance which has a number of examples of particular situations that may come up and how you're best to deal with those. So I just wanted to run through briefly each of those 6 areas. So the first one is around sort of general advice, and if there's a situation where you're asked a particular question and how you're best to handle that. So the advice from the guidance is don't feel pressured to act immediately. You can take questions on notice if needed. You can refer back to your probity plan and then seek advice and make sure that your response that you're going to provide is definitely the best way to go. The second one is around gifts and benefits within procurement. So this is an area which is particularly important for procurement. So public service employees cannot be offered, accept or give gifts and benefits. So that's just something to keep in mind throughout the procurement process. The third one there is around conducting early market engagement and industry briefings. So this is a good opportunity to understand the capability from suppliers within your market before developing your strategy. So it is important though to ensure throughout that process and with the different briefings that you're not undertaking any commitments on behalf of council. And if you are going to use a probity advisor, if it is high risk or high dollar value, it would be good to get them engaged early so that they were also part of that market engagement and industry briefings initially. So the fourth one is around trade shows and conferences. So there isn't an issue to go and attend those trade shows and conferences. It's just around ensuring that you're not sharing any confidential information and, again, not forming any verbal agreements in discussions with people that might come through those trade shows and conferences. The fifth area is around evaluating innovation in offers. So that's something that we're seeing more often in procurement, and that procurement is driving innovation. So it's just ensuring that the same principles apply. So regardless of what you're procuring, the principles that we've just run through in detail, they still apply. And the last one's around anti-competitive behaviour. So there is an ACCC guidance on this, and we can pop the link in at the end as well, just around having a look at that anti-competitive supplier behaviour. So that was an overview of the guidelines from Queensland. What we thought we would do, given that we're based in New South Wales, is just give you a bit of an overview of what the guidelines look like from a New South Wales perspective. So what we find, so we're on the border of New South Wales and Victoria, so we would look at both sets of guidance, and if one state doesn't cover something, it's always good to have a look in different states' guidance. So that might be something that's helpful from time to time. So noting that the Queensland guidance is very helpful, but it is sometimes useful to look at other states as well. So the tendering guidelines for New South Wales Local Government were written in October 2009, and they've got a number of elements to be included as well. So what we've popped up is just the role of the tender panel and what that should include. So very similar to Queensland, it talks about preparing an evaluation methodology, conducting a review and assessment of tenders, looking at the performance against the set criteria. So as mentioned earlier, ensuring that that criteria is set before the tender goes out and is evaluated, and preparing a detailed assessment. So this also looks at whether you can split that assessment, so whether it might be one assessment for price and then another assessment for the other elements of your tender. This is just a continuation from that guidance from New South Wales. So talking about how you would formulate your recommendation up to council to award that contract, ensuring that there is appropriate documentation. So records management is very important, and that always comes up in a number of reviews. So making sure if your process is challenged that you can go back through that documentation and justify how that process was conducted. New South Wales has a complaints handling process which can either follow council's normal complaints handling process or have a specific one for that procurement process, and then maintaining minutes. So that's that really good record keeping.
Thanks, Alison. So across to evaluation panels, and we said earlier, you know, we need champion teams, not a team of champions. And so in this evaluation panel space, one of the really key call outs is not always does everyone have to be hugely qualified or hugely experienced, but it's about making sure that we've got the mix right. We can't assemble a panel where no one has been on a panel before in terms of a probity outcome. And so council really needs to put some planning thought into that appropriate mix and match of personnel going on, so that we're actually giving opportunities for more junior talent or inexperienced people to gain some experience, and so that we're then de-risking our entity by having multiple people inside council who've actually participated and sat on a panel. You'll notice in the bullet points that there's a couple of things that might seem a little bit opposed to each other. Separate teams with no involvement in the procurement, establishing the evaluation criteria, and balancing that off against, but if nobody's bringing any technical expertise to the process, how we will comply with good governance from a probity structure perspective, but get a rubbish outcome in potentially the contract award and execution phase. So it's about making sure the construct of the team brings sufficient expertise, but also personnel outside of that area, because what we're really looking for is some of that naivety, inquisitive mind, and that helps bring questions of doubt to light, and helps the panel make sure that the step process that they're following continues to have rigour, and we're just not assuming that different steps of the process have been executed. So it's really about making sure that we've got that mix there. And I know Alison has called it out before, but the final bullet point on the page here, we do encounter this a couple of times, that the weighting's actually being decided or recalibrated would be the kind term in some councils at the time of the panel actually sitting down to do it. The weightings really, in best case scenario, and should be set at the time that the contract is put out for response, and then they're set at that stage, and so they're clear for all panel members, as opposed to panel members trying to redistribute the weightings applied at the time of coming together to evaluate responses. In terms of probity plans, so the key shout out here is neither in Queensland or in New South Wales, neither party actually sets out the specific matters that you need to have included in your probity plan. So that gives you some flexibility to tailor it to the specific needs of your council, and again, make sure it's fit for purpose. The minimum here, though, the minimum is the use of a checklist. For some local councils, the introduction of a checklist would actually be a starting point and a step forward on their maturity journey, and that's completely fine. Everyone has to start somewhere, but the introduction of, at a minimum, a probity checklist at that low value, low risk end just makes more sure that we're bringing a methodical and consistent approach towards the demonstration of probity. In terms of a story that really brings this home for me was, I attended a risk management professional development session a couple of years ago, and it was delivered by a pilot. And he had all these years of experience. He showed footage of different things that he'd done and flown commercially, then professionally, doing even some work for movie studios. And he was a self-confessed good pilot. So in our technique of people, systems and process and governance, he thought he passed the good person test. But the one thing he stressed was that he always used a documented pre-takeoff checklist. And you would think, why? This guy's done this heaps and heaps of times, and he's highly experienced, and by his own admission, he calls himself good. And what he would say was that, yes, okay, if I got it right, no one would remember, and there was no prizes for that. But essentially, there was no alternative. If he got it wrong and didn't do all the steps, there was really no coming back from that. So he really only had one choice, and that was to use a pre-takeoff checklist every time. So that brings it back to this importance of, regardless if you've been on the probity panel before, regardless if you think you know the steps, using a checklist, A, just helps check that you don't forget anything, and B, it's that demonstration of good governance that we actually moved through the process from step to step to step. Alison.
Thanks, Brad. So we've got the checklist for Queensland. New South Wales is more in the space of referring back to council's policy and what the procurement policy might include. Just as a third comparison, we've got some dot points here around the Victorian guidance. So their procurement guidelines from 2013 note a number of elements that probity plans should include for your procurement. So what we've got there is that strip list. Probably the main areas to shout out there are the roles and responsibilities of each participant. So that's whether each person on the panel has the same role. Is there someone that needs to be taking the minutes? Is there a person that's going to be contacting any tenderers if there's any particular questions? It's just really documenting those roles and responsibilities up front. Timelines is also important. We've seen a number of probity plans that don't necessarily set out the goalposts in terms of we're starting here and then this is the evaluation timeline and this is what we're aiming for in terms of finishing. So those timelines can be very important. And communication protocols, so ensuring that if a tenderer needs to be contacted, that there is a protocol for that and how that will take place, if there's questions and who's to contact them and that sort of thing. So this is a bit of a good guide on particular areas to include in a probity plan, and just a bit of compare and contrast between states if you're looking for some extra guidance.
So the next phase in this process would be a probity review. And so here, some of the key call outs that I feel are relevant or applicable are that in the probity review, there can be guidance and advice on how probity issues should be addressed. Now, the very simple example that we would encounter here would be a question has been asked in the tender, but people have interpreted that question in different ways and given a response where they're not all the same. And so think of it in the simplest terms of the tender said, can you mark these things in an order of 1, 2, 3, but the response comes back as A, B, C. Well, clearly A, B, C is different from 1, 2, 3. So does that mean then it's not a non-complying tender? Does can the committee then go back to the tender and ask them to reconfirm it, which may impact on time delays? Or in some instances, can a decision be made consulting with the probity advisor that can we agree that ABC is the same as 1, 2, 3? So these scenarios come in, but if we're working through making sure that our process has good governance, we need to make sure that that consistency of response is a fundamental probity issue that can come through to mean that people are doing this apples with apples type comparison. The other call out is advise on the project's development down the bottom of the page. If it's a larger project, it is quite possible to get probity review documentation at different stages on the way through the process, because sometimes the project can extend out over a period of time. So if the audit committee has a particular appetite for feedback around, say this was a management letter point, and you were looking to improve and show demonstration of improved governance in this space, you can obtain reports that give clearance at the panel formation stage, at the receipt of submission stage, at the evaluation stage, and the project finalisation stage. Moving through onto the next one here, there's a few more points around probity reviews, and we've got them on the slide. I suppose the two key things for me on this is calling out costs down the bottom left. There's two ways it can be approached. It's either done on a per hour basis or on a block cost basis. Better governance would suggest it's done on a per hour basis, which then means that the allocation of time is not a limiting factor. The reward for the probity involvement is linked to it. It also gives the capacity for it to flex up and down, because in some instances the probity process moves through smoother, and therefore that cost impost doesn't need to be borne by council. In a probity review thing, I think the main thing to call out, and perhaps as we move around the different geographies, the sin is that the probity reviewer actually becomes a player on the field. So using Alison's terminology earlier of the goalposts shifted, I think it's really important to be clear that the probity reviewer, they're not a player on the panel. If you think in sporting terms, they're the umpire. And the best game is when the umpire is not seen. And why is that? It's because the rules are clear and the players play to the rules. So the probity reviewer really can be the person in white who's got the whistle and helps keep the game flowing, but really they're not a player on the field. That's the result of the actual panel members. And if they've had the rules clearly explained to them up front, and they comply with the outline of the rules, really the probity reviewer should be sight unseen and the process flows through.
Thanks, Brad. So I just wanted to touch on some common areas for improvement. So we've touched on a few of these along the way, but just to sort of pull those together into one slide for us. So probity plan completion pre-starting evaluation. So we would commonly see a probity plan that might be prepared sort of later in the piece. It really should be before you go to tender and then before you start evaluating. So just making sure that you get that completed before those couple of steps. The conflict of interest declaration, so making sure that they're done at the start of the process, that you consider all different scenarios which could potentially give rise to a conflict, and making sure that that's documented. The weighting and criteria we've mentioned a couple of times, so making sure that that is locked in and ready to go before having a look at any of that tender documentation that might come through. Probity policies and procedures. So usually with reviews, so I guess it's also important to distinguish we can be an advisor, so sitting on the panel, as Brad mentioned, not as a player but as an advisor if questions come up, or a review where we would sort of look through the process after it's happened. But an element of that would be having a look at your policies and procedures and just making sure you're across those and that they're up to date as well. And the last one we've got there is around training. So if you have a panel member that may not have been through a process before or hasn't done one for a while, just running through some training on the key elements of going back to that Queensland guidance and sort of running through, here's the aim of probity and this is what we're trying to achieve. And that could be a refresher that's done at the start of a tender.
So in terms of maturity assessment, these are very popular in risk management, internal audit world. And so if you're in the finance team or the procurement team, or even you've got a governance role with council, we dropped in this maturity assessment to try and give you the tool to be able to assess where you're at. So if we start with perfect is not possible, but improvement always is, a tool such as a maturity assessment really comes into its own. Using the elements shown here on the slide, you can rate yourself where you are today. So where am I at? And then it's really a bit of a gap analysis. Where do you want to be and by when? And if you can understand where am I now, where do I want to get to and by when, that will dictate how much time, energy and dollars you need to invest in that journey to move the triangles on this screen from compliant through to developed and through to advanced. Probably some more higher level commentary or granular commentary would be, you don't have to be at advanced for all of these elements. That would come back to what your risk appetite is. So if you've got zero risk appetite around these things, well, sure, let's move the dial to advanced on all of those elements. But it's quite possible, according to your risk appetite, which might be informed and influenced by council's previous governance history and a myriad of things, that a landing of either compliant or developed is completely fine. As long as that has been done with your eyes wide open and agreed, we see that as being completely fine. But this maturity assessment really is a handy little tool just to try and take stock of, well, what's a fair assessment of where I am today and where would we like to get through to? And then you can just map yourself between where it is that change is required or where it is that effort is required, such as that training element that Alison just mentioned, to continue to be compliant, if compliant is where you're at and where you'd like to stay, because standing still is not really an option.
Thanks, Brad. So just moving into some case studies. So we've touched on a couple of examples as we've gone through this morning, but this is another document that we'll reference and will come around in the slides. So this is an information sheet that came out in June of this year. It's from the CCC and it looked at ethics and probity in procurement. So it had a look at the ethics principles, which we've got listed there, and in terms of what this found, so it was issued in June, but it was actually conducted in March 2021, and it was a local government procurement audit across 4 councils in remote and Indigenous areas. The audit examined whether councils had effective procurement processes and practices in place to manage corruption risks. So it revealed that although the required goods and services were delivered from these processes, there was a number of reasons where the decisions that were made were unclear. So that comes back to our record keeping and the need to improve and demonstrate what systems are in place to record how those decisions are made. So failure to keep accurate and complete records means that decision makers cannot justify to their communities why money was spent in a particular way. So that one, it's about 8 pages, so it's an easy read and would be something good to have a look at if that's something that you haven't seen to date. So we'll attach that into the slides as well, so you can look that one up.
And so in terms of getting the right approach, the Crime and Corruption Commission has outlined 4 elements here that Alison sort of replicated on the screen for us. But for me, these 4 steps essentially take us back to the root cause elements that we flagged at the start of today's session. And these were, you need to get the right people involved, we need to have policy and procedure covered, and we need to have governance covered. And that governance element is culture, tone at the top type elements. So if we can demonstrate those 3 elements, we really are addressing the 4 key steps that the Crime and Corruption Commission are giving us the pointer on.
Thanks, Brad. So within that document, there's some additional resources listed. So they're CCC publications there, the probity plan checklist that we mentioned earlier, and a couple of other bits and pieces to have a look at. So those, along with the Queensland procurement guidelines that we've gone through, are great places to start to have a look at and even use as part of your training that's been recommended for your processes. So that is all of the slides that we've got for this morning. So we might hand back over to Michael.
Great. Thank you, Alison and Brad. That was a great session, very topical, very relevant. So thank you very much. I was probably one question, if I could quickly ask one, regarding the maturity assessment. I think our members would be quite familiar with where things are heading in the industry with maturity assessments, particularly at the moment with the Queensland Audit Office. They've introduced maturity assessment around councils and how they prepare their financial statements each year. Is there, are you aware if there's any tools or toolkits available for in terms of procurement probity maturity assessments at all, or is that something that you could generally do, you know, without too much difficulty within your own organisation?
So what we did with that example was use the 4 key elements from the guidance, and then we added a couple of additional elements, which was the risk management, monitoring and communication. So we thought they were sort of 7 key areas for procurement that would be good to have a look at from that maturity perspective. But then it would be added to as there was a particular area that accountants need to get a gauge on how they were tracking.
Yeah, Michael, the Institute of Internal Auditors have got some really good materials on their website. So if any of your LGFP members are similarly members of the Institute of Internal Auditors, they've got some really good and simple models to use in maturity assessments. So that would be a great place to start and look.
Well, that's great. Thanks. Thanks, Brad. And look, again, thank you very much for your presentation. It's much appreciated. Look, we didn't get too many questions through, which is, look, again, not unusual. I think there was a fair bit to absorb there. A lot of it, though, common sense, and, you know, just being in the industry and knowing the importance of procurement probity, particularly in Queensland, we're in there's been a lot of reform in legislation around coming out of the Belcara challenges we've had in local government. There's a higher level of focus on probity and oversight of particularly local government operations, conflicts of interest in particular. So yeah, so I'm aware that members will be well versed in, you know, particularly the procurement requirements around probity. Just for me, a couple of key points. The takeaway was important. Check your procurement plan first. Is it current? Does it reflect better practice? So that was a takeaway that I'm going to take away and have a look at. I think the other one was the improving areas. So again, for the members out there, you know, have a look at your processes, your probity plans being prepared in advance of the evaluation. You know, are your conflicts of interest declarations up to speed? Is there supporting information for the panelists to refer to if in terms of looking at those different types of conflicts of interest? Are you setting your weightings and criteria properly, you know, before your first evaluation meeting? Are you keeping minutes? Are your policies and procedures up to date? And are you doing regular training? Because that's another key one. You know, local governments get turnover in staff. The ongoing training need is very important. So look, and obviously then, and the last one there was a maturity assessment. It doesn't look too difficult to do. And thanks, Brad, for that advice there regarding the tools available. And members can refer back to this presentation to look at accessing that information if we need. So look, wrapping up, thank you very much, everyone. And we appreciate your time. Thanks again to Alison and Brad for presenting from Crowe. It's much appreciated, and some great takeaways there for our members. So thank you very much, and everyone out there, take care.